Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 19 of our podcast. We're your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, what's up, man? Guys, today we've got some pretty interesting topics. On Present Futures, we'll be discussing the future of life and the Internet of Things and what it means for society. On Paleo Futures, we will be discussing Bladerunner. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing investing in India. And as always, we will have a prominent futurist as our guest. We hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle at SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us on social media. Now let's see what the future has in store for us in SomeFuture.
That's SomeFuture.
All right, Chris, for my present futures, I wanted to bring something up that, obviously we talk a lot about medicine on this show. Recently it seems that every day a new technology associated with medicine is helping people live longer, recover from injuries quicker, and treat or prevent diseases that before have killed millions of people. So I wanted to take a few minutes to explore fascinating new vaccines and medical treatments that are being developed right now, which could cure or help prevent so many things that affect so many of us. In the past 20 years, vaccine technology has improved, resulting in production of vaccines against a broad range of infectious and non-infectious diseases. Nevertheless, despite these new technologies, the burden of infectious diseases worldwide remains very high, particularly in developing countries. According to the World Health Organization, infections still account for about 40% of all recorded deaths worldwide. While we are probably aware of scientists' research on preventing and treating diseases like HIV, pneumonia, STDs, measles, malaria, and polio, the point of this present futures is to discuss new treatments and ways that vaccines are being used, unlike anything you may have heard of. Unfortunately, as awesome as all of this sounds, it's not all sunshine and roses for vaccines. In fact, we have to look at the dictionary definition of a vaccine and what it is now becoming. According to the World Health Organization, a vaccine is a biological preparation that improves immunity to a particular disease, typically contains an agent that resembles a disease-causing microorganism, and that is often made from a weakened or killed form of the microbe, its toxins, or one of its surface proteins. So the idea is for this weakened or killed microbes to stimulate the body's immune system to recognize the agent as foreign, destroy it, and remember it, so that the immune system can more easily recognize and destroy any of these microorganisms that it later encounters. That pretty much in a nutshell is how the process is supposed to work. So, you think of these microbes as germs or pathogens, microorganisms that sometimes cause infections that can lead to this disease. Vaccines are specifically designed to combat diseases caused by viruses and bacteria. At least that's traditionally been the case. However, there's a growing tendency by the pharmaceutical industry, again, big industry, what we were just talking about, to broaden the meaning of the word vaccine and use it interchangeably with medicine or the word medicine or drug. So that now all sorts of new vaccines, quotation marks around the word vaccines, are being developed for diseases, illnesses, or conditions that have nothing to do with viruses or bacteria. The reason? So I'm going into a long explanation with this, but there's a reason behind all of this. So in a 2011 Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court voted to make pharmaceutical companies not liable for harm related to vaccine treatments recommended or mandated by the government. Therefore, all sorts of new vaccines, which are actually medicines or other forms of treatment, are being created that have little to do with the formal definition of what a vaccine is. So, for example, there's a pharmaceutical companies, they're working on vaccines for things for stress, for preventing high cholesterol, stopping cigarette smoking, a cure for obesity, sea lice, and even ones to cure homosexuality and pedophilia. So there's even apparently being that's not even the worst of it. There's a vaccine being developed called FunVax, which is short for fundamentalist vaccine, aimed at modifying the behavior of religious fundamentalist terrorists. All of this might sound like the proverbial traveling miracle salesman in the early old Western days with magical cure-alls. There is still a lot of hard science behind many of these treatments, and so not to knock it completely. And many of them do have real implications for the future of humanity. So I wanted to start with something that's a little bit funny, but has some serious, it has a serious, one of those serious implications I was talking about. So currently there is a vaccine being developed in China that promises to help patients combat dental caries, which a carie is a scientific name for dental cavity. Now, while you and I probably brush our teeth and visit the dentist regularly, around 90% of school-aged children and adults in the world do not have adequate access to dental care and therefore suffer from dental cavities. So this new vaccine, while not being able to prevent cavities completely, would be able to reduce the chances of suffering from tooth decay and help us retain a healthy smile for longer, which is a great idea. If you want to continue into the incredible advances in dental medicine, there's researchers in the UK and the United States came up with a drug that was originally designed to treat Alzheimer's. I'm sure you've heard of this, that can repair cavities. So instead of drilling and capping a cavity, imagine a very not so distant future where your teeth can be repaired instead of suffering long-term damage that really never goes away while just covering it with filling. So outside of our teeth, new vaccines and medicines are being developed right now that promise to end some of the world's most serious diseases and disorders and helps us live longer and more full lives. There's a drug currently in development called everolimus, which has been proven to extend the life of animals by 20 to 25%. While this may not seem like a lot, this could enable human beings to live to 120 years old or older on average. That's average. That was in the realm of fantasy a couple of years ago. But people and companies like Google are putting serious money, like in the billions of dollars, towards anti-aging and new therapies to combat the effects of aging. In fact, many researchers are now starting to treat aging as a disease and not just a process that we will have to go through as a fact of life. R.J. Kirk is a world-renowned biotech expert, has claimed that we will have a cure for most cancers within the next 10 years. 10 years. Not only that, but that we will have cures to some of the world's biggest killers, like cancer, through these vaccines, or through other techniques and methods that will enable us to not only live longer, but live healthier lives. Therefore, in this podcast, we will continue to report about it, I think, and we'll let you know what we have researched and found out about. And hopefully 100 years in the future, that we'll hear this podcast and remember the current generations as pioneers for these technologies. So, Chris, what other vaccines, technologies have you heard of that just astound you and that maybe we haven't mentioned yet on the podcast?
Yeah, well, to me, it's not just the vaccines. I think it's about the what we're doing. Not only with CRISPR technology, but nanomaterials and how they're going to start to affect cellular, everything from cellular production to cellular operations, optimization of the human body through proper supplements or added things. This is this sort of stuff has been happening right ever since we started using steroids and human growth hormones starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And of course, the supplement industry took very kindly to that, and I think there's some issues. Essentially, what a vaccine is supplementing your body, right? Okay, we're going to give you this chemical. This chemical is going to react with your body, and it's going to put you in a position for a positive life force, which is going to allow you to combat these potential diseases. I think the issue that comes to that is are some of these vaccines, the way they're created, have they been done in an effective manner? A lot of these vaccine companies, sometimes they're known to have sort of tainted vaccinations. They've had problems, right? It takes care of the disease problem, but oh, by the way, it adds to this particular problem. So I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've had every vaccine under the sun because I was in the military. And I think, not having to deal with the mumps or chickenpox, shingles, smallpox is particularly, polio is particularly helpful to society. And I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. And because, we do have some issues when it comes to vaccinations and what they could be used for, that we're going to just, get rid of all of them. But we have to do a better job at real-time analysis of the human body, and I think that this is where medicine is going, right? So at the cellular level, the nano level, right? As nanomedicine becomes particularly important. We also, I think, instead of having medicine that is used to treat the human body at large, writ large, I think that's super important. But personalized medicine is really the future of medicine. And if you combine that with real time analytical analysis of your body, you're probably going to see a high optimization of lifetimes. And you may see people living not only to 80 or 90 years like they're doing in some of those blue zones, but possibly into their hundreds and early hundreds as consistently as possible. And our children and grandchildren, they may see that just because of the development of all these great things. So technology is going to be a big part of it. I think, though, that we have to remember that this medicine is highly personal. Perhaps vaccinations don't work with certain phenotypes. They don't work with certain people. They don't work with certain groups of people, certain regions. The human body is extremely complex. And so we've got to do a better job at real-time analysis of it so we can ensure what we put in our body is doing a really good job of optimizing it as best as possible.
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, I think you and I would agree on this, is that you should be wary of anything that's claiming to be a cure-all or a vaccine when in fact it's a medicine, and it may not be exactly for you. It will be an individual type of medicine that will cost probably thousands of dollars, at least in the future. But I think people should also be cautiously optimistic. We're in a period of rapid scientific exploration and discovery. Once we reach intelligent AI or the singularity, we'll probably, we definitely will have intelligent researchers helping us solve these issues, and they'll be, going 24 hours a day. And as I have been saying for the past 11 years, I believe that the millennials' grandchildren, so our grandchildren, will be the last generation to really die, as in old age die. Now, while we might be certain, while we're probably uncertain of what that form of life will take, people merging with computers, downloading their consciousness, etc. I do believe that this is a goal that is worthy, and it's one that we can achieve and we should achieve.
Okay, cool. So for my SomeFuture, I wanted to bring up the Internet of Things, which I think we've talked about it on the podcast before. I think so, right? A little bit, just to kind of bring people up to what is the Internet of Things. It's essentially a network of physical devices, whether it's vehicles, home appliances, anything with electronics, software, sensors, actuators, which is connected and exchanges data. So examples of this include smart grids, virtual power plants, smart home technology like Nest or a smart refrigerator, intelligent transportation, smart cities, right? So when we're talking about things, these are heart monitoring implants, biochip transponders. This actually really, the original Internet of Things was RFID technology. So having the ability to track where your Amazon stuff is around the world, that's an understanding of what the Internet of Things is doing. So there's been a lot of promise in terms of what the Internet of Things could do. It's kind of really interesting, right? Because yes, it's awesome. I can actually change I have the Nest, right? So I can change my heating inside my house from my phone, which is particularly cool. The ability to have like a juicer, be able to make a juice at a certain time, coffee turned on at a certain time, lights, being able to connect themselves whenever you walk into a room, right? This is the sci-fi connected society that we were talking about. But one thing that isn't getting brought up a lot, and I think it's also maybe it's not that it's getting brought up, but this is the reason why the Internet of Things has not taken off as quickly as possible, is that there's a lot of problems when it comes to the Internet of Things, and I wanted to sort of explore a couple of those with you now. And the problems range from a lot of things. Number one, though, security, right? So we all know that once we're not only online with our computers, but even ourselves, security is a big issue, whether it's somebody stealing our social security numbers because they exist in some plane somewhere, like the Equifax stuff, or even the Target or Home Depot hacking, where people's identifications are stolen. Security is a really big issue when it comes to Internet of Things, because it's such an important part of society, right? Keeping things on, whether it's a fridge, whether it's a thermostat, whether it's your own electricity, it's your car. And if you have bugs in the system, like let's say a self-driving car that all of a sudden gets disconnected from the internet, so to speak, it's going to shut things off. And did you see there was, I think it was Wired, but it was folks that they hacked into somebody's vehicle, right? Because vehicles are not only the engines now, but you have more electronics and sometimes more computer technology in your car than they had currently than they had when they went to the moon. Go ahead.
There's sensors, there's automatic stopping, there's
right.
Tesla now has the semi-autonomous vehicle, that type of thing.
Right, exactly. So these if there's a security hole that can be exploited when it comes to IoT technology, this is a real huge issue. And along the way of connectivity as well, right? We have to stay on. In some ways, this is technology's big issue. We have to have electrical power. You can't have some EMP flash that disconnects society, because the nuclear reactor will stop, Hoover Dam, hydroelectric will stop. We've got a lot of issues here. When it comes to this. And not only that, but there's things like privacy concerns. So giving your data with how much stuff you're buying inside your fridge, or how much do you want to be connected. We were talking about that when we were bringing up what is human rights in the age of connectivity. So these are just some of the issues that we have. There's some others I can talk to you a little bit about. But are you just as concerned about the IoT world as I am?
Dude, I'm really concerned. I'll be honest with you. I mean, this is why you're seeing a lot more regulation. Maybe not as much in the United States, but in Europe and other places. Is that in Europe there actually is a right to be forgotten, and companies like Google, who collect so much user data and then sell that to third parties, they're getting sued out the wazoo right now, because that's the idea of freedom versus liberty. Our freedom versus security. And the idea of, obviously, if you've got a smart speaker in your house, that's one thing. It is constantly listening to you. So every conversation that you have in your house, it is constantly being recorded. And, even though, Amazon says they don't sell that to other people, or, the Googles, or, the Google Home or whatever, I find that hard to believe that they're not using that some way in a financial means. You look at it this way. Even in one of the articles that you included in your supporting arguments, is that you said basically there's something as harmless as a Roomba can actually be taking the entire a map of your house and using that to sell you things. Roomba sells that data, the idea of big data. All these IoT devices are collecting this big data they end up selling to other people. Dude, I guess I'm most worried about regulation and privacy. I mean, those are my two major concerns, because I believe that they lag behind the development of these devices. I don't think that these devices collect so much data. I don't like that they collect so much data, and I feel like we need to find a way to protect ourselves. I mean, imagine, we have this idea of the big what was it that the insurance, or not, the financial data company that was recently hacked.
Equifax.
Yeah, Equifax, the whole Equifax, hacking, where it was over 300 million people were affected, which is pretty much all of the United States was affected by this. And they got all of this financial data just out in the air. I mean, what happens next if that's Apple and one of their devices that is recording things? Or with Microsoft, the back door that was discovered with Microsoft a year or two ago. these ideas of, you can look into someone's computer and, see them. That's why people now put these things on their computers, because they don't want people watching them. That's a huge issue. We need to, be able to protect ourselves, and we need to say, this is our data. We may be sharing some things with you, but you are not okay to sell that to somebody else, and you're not okay to record that and keep that in your records. That is not okay. And we need to do something against that.
No, I agree, and so this started because I saw this. The Internet of Things is going to send us back to the Middle Ages, and I was like, "Whoa, what does that mean?" And essentially, what they're trying to say in this is that the problem is that these companies are going to own the data. They're going to own the ecosystems. That's another big issue, right? Is Apple is notorious for, you have to have this whole Apple system in order to make it work, right? Not only that, but they're going to own the baseline data. They're saying this is similar to John Deere, where they say, the customers don't necessarily own the tractors. We're just licensing the software to them. You can't actually repair your own stuff. You can't repair your own iPhone. You can't actually repair things when they get messed up. So in essence, the medieval kingdom, why this would be like medieval Europe, the king owned everything. You were dependent on the king's rights to work that land. You were granted, the liege by the king to do this. And essentially, that's what these big companies are doing. They're saying, we're going to grant you the ability to be on Facebook. We're going to grant you the ability to, work in this interconnected world, but we're going to own the data. We're going to own how that world works. We're going to own the rules. This is actually even what I think is interesting here is that this is separate than the government rules, right? Because they're creating their own sort of systems in place, right? Facebook's got 2 billion people on it. That's the biggest country on the planet. And what happens in Facebook, the communication between it is very powerful, and it has nothing to do with government regulations at all. And I think that's what we see why they're having issues there when it comes to not only the 2016 election, but when it comes to listening. I just saw an article, or it was a video. This guy said he didn't have a cat, and he decided to just talk about cats all the time, like kitty litter or something, over 2 or 3 days. I don't know if you saw this.
Yes.
And within a couple of days, like, he kept getting advertisements on his Facebook feed all about kitty litter. And so do we have the ability to not be connected? Are we going to be forced to be a part of these ecosystems? What happens when the whole thing is disconnected? Does the society just shut down because it's not capable? And also, what are those people, just like you said, that don't want to be connected? They don't want to be a part of the ecosystems. They want to go back to less is more when it comes to being around members of society. Now, I think the Internet of Things got a long way to go. My guess is over the next coming decades, the Internet of Things not only will continue to evolve. There'll be security protocols put into place. There'll be government legislation that's going to be an extremely important part of its evolution too. That's going to hopefully mitigate any negative effects that the IoT has. Now, I do not want to get rid of this technology. I don't want to say, let's just trash it and put it in the bin. I just think it needs a lot of attention in order to steward it properly.
Well, it needs accountability too. Like, these companies, the fact that Equifax is still a company blows my mind. Like, I think they should not be a company anymore. They should have been sued out the wazoo. They should have not had any sort of finances left to continue as a company. The fact that, with Apple, when Apple was hacked, as celebrities' phones were hacked and like personal photos and stuff were stolen a couple of years ago. The fact that they weren't sued, like, incredibly, like, where's the accountability? That's what Europe is, like, a lot of the EU is trying to do, is like, look, you're accountable for this information. You should not be storing it. You should be deleting it, and you shouldn't be selling it to people. Like, that's not something that should be even considered.
Yeah.
I'm worried about, what happens when these IoT devices are eventually hacked, and that have been getting hacked. And, you come home to watch like a big football game, and you're on your smart TV, and it's been hacked, and you have to pay in order to watch, the show. Like, that's all things that can happen, and that have been happening, and they're saying that that's going to continue to happen. Where's the accountability? Like, if you sell a device, it should not be hackable, and if it is, you should be held accountable. Then that way you don't sell the device. That simple.
Yeah. And I think what you're going to see as well is there's going to be a lot of folks like, the Kennedy School of Government and the Said and, some of the B schools, as well as the public policy schools. They're going to start to work with these companies to figure out how the evolution of technology is going to allow society to stay functioning. And this, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Cisco and the Internet of Things, whether it's privacy and big data concerns, these companies which move faster than the speed of government. Government has to do a better job of understanding the implications of these technologies in our lives, how it could, what are the black swan events that could happen, so they can understand how to build protocols against that. And like you were saying before, keep people accountable, keep these private companies, which are they're private companies that make money off of this information and will continue and make money off of these products that are potentially dangerous. We have to set up a regulatory environment to take care of this stuff. We did this with vehicles. We did this with energy sources that may be polluting factors. We did this with lots of things, and we cannot have the information age dominate so much that we forget what are some of the big holes that it has when it comes to security, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to the longevity of the human beings on Earth. We've got to create the frameworks for this technology to be successful. I think we're just beginning to figure that out now, but I'll be interested to see what we'll be doing in the next couple decades. Okay, so for Paleo Futures, Jack and I were just bringing this up a little while ago when we were trying to figure out what was the next Paleo Futures. I was like, man, you know what? I had just watched the original Bladerunner and never saw it before. And I was like, yeah, let's talk about it. I got to say, it's probably one of the greatest pieces of science fiction I've ever seen. And, the fact that it was made in 1982 was, really revolutionary. I really don't think it even gets its due, because I saw so many parts of so many different, video games, anime, television series, science fiction films. I mean, this, I think, set a great visual aesthetic, as well as really just an interesting story put forth. So, let's get into it. What is Blade Runner? So it's the 1982 American neo-noir science fiction film. Is directed by Ridley Scott, who he had directed Alien. I'm trying to think what other things he's directed. I think he directed what's that one with Heat. That's that's one of my favorite ones. He directed Kingdom of Heaven, Black Hawk Down, Gladiator, The Martian. I mean, just the dude is really, really great. I'm a big fan of his. So Blade Runner is it's science fiction. It's based on an adaptation from Philip K. Dick, who we've talked about on Paleo Futures before. His novel "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep," and it's set in a dystopian Los Angeles in 2019, where synthetic humans, otherwise known as replicants, are bioengineered by this powerful corporation to work in these, off-world colonies so that they can do all their work. And there's a fugitive group of these replicants, and they have like super speed and really powerful, because they're essentially, synthetic robots, if you will. And this guy, Rick Deckard, who's played by Harrison Ford, he goes to hunt these folks down. So really interesting in terms of its aesthetics. It's actually what I think it's fairly beautiful. Lots of cool features, technology that's in it. There's flying cars. There's these huge advertisements. Much of Los Angeles at this time. So by the way, this is set in 2019. So it's the future Los Angeles. Obviously the replicant factor, the fact that there's synthetic people and robots in the future. I think that's obviously another futures element that is really cool. One thing that I really also thought that was really interesting about it was how the future looks so bleak. It's dark, literally and metaphorically, really. It's very, there's a foreboding element. There's a Blade Runner has, it's raining a lot. It's dirty. And it's just, humanity is just sort of all over the place. It's what I would think people thought New York City was going to turn into, when they lived there in the 70s, until Giuliani came and cleaned up, Times Square. And now it's a sort of capitalistic wonderland.
But it's not just humanity, it's Asian humanity everywhere, which I thought was kind of racist in 1982, but
yeah, well, I mean, it's just a very, very interesting way of, designing the future. It's very moody, interesting place. These huge buildings. The technology was also extremely important, right? The way that they were, Deckard at one point is using recording technology, and he's essentially a detective. So this is like a noir sort of thing, and he's being able to zoom in on these very specific but pictures, so he can solve the case, if you will. And that's this technology that we didn't have, and of course we didn't have flying cars, either as well. So it's just a really interesting movie. I think it had a huge impact on the visualization of a lot of different films, to include movies like Ghost in the Shell. I think this is extremely influential in the cyberpunk movement. This is one of those movies that's like it's in the cyberpunk Bible as a way of seeing what the future may hold. Lots of folks. Deus Ex was a part of this. The first person shooter, Perfect Dark, and this was seen as a major influence on this. There's a graphical text adventure called Cypher, Rise of the Dragon, Shadowrun. Any sort of sci-fi movie, or sci-fi piece of entertainment that shows this dark sci-fi sort of world is a part of the legacy that is Blade Runner. So I can't say enough about it. I think it was really not only is it a cool movie to watch visually, but in terms of futures, yes, the technology is there. I think the idea of a future being not necessarily a happy-go-lucky place, and the fact that there are not only these issues with these replicants, but there seems to be issues with society. This dystopian look at the future. That has been a baseline theme for a lot of these films in the future. They have this breakdown. I'll put it in the show notes of the ingredients for sci-fi dystopia, and there's these 7 ingredients, right? There's AI gone wild, evil mega corporation, iron-fisted government, extreme wealth and extreme poverty, thought control, ecological disaster, and lawless gangs. So Blade Runner hits on, I think, five out of the 7. Which is super interesting there. So it's definitely a dystopian for sure. But yeah, I think this was aesthetically and then just how it was put together, such a powerful movie in sci-fi genre, and yeah, just really interesting film to watch.
Yeah. So I mean, I looked at when you mentioned that we were going to do this, I rewatched the original Blade Runner, and I wrote down like some of the themes I saw. So one of them I brought up was, first off, I thought the movie was pretty racist. I guess it's 1982, but like they have an Egyptian guy in the movie who just babbles, makes random babbling noises. They have a lot of Chinese people who seem like, or Asian people who seem really dirty, and and I think that was interesting. I guess it is a reflection of what our world population is doing. Is Asian population is rising. So I guess that is a reflection of it. It's just interesting that that's what they were using. I think that some interesting things that they brought up was it called into the question of do robots have rights? Should they? Are we gods who then can just give them this fruit of knowledge and also the fruit of immortality? It brought up the idea of what is human. What is human? Can someone who is crazy and acts nothing but irrational be human? I think if you look at the relationship between Deckard and Rachel, so I think that is really cool. And the fact that, Deckard, he doesn't realize that he himself is, possibly a replicant, but he's afraid of Rachel at first. We're always afraid of something that we can't understand, the inhuman. And I think that that's the idea of man versus machine, how man seems so fleeting, and how the machine seems so powerful, and like it's just like us building something that's better than ourselves, and if Deckard was told at the very, beginning of the film when he was walking into the police chief's office, he says, Deckard, you're either one of us or you're one of them. So I think that's really interesting themes of, what is human, what is robotic, what does it mean to be a good person? All of these things were themes that were playing out throughout the film. Um, I really liked, those aspects of it, those themes.
Yeah, and the world's coming to machines, having machines all around us, and them impacting our lives. We talk about it a lot on the podcast. Whether can a machine love? Can a machine have sentience? I think is particularly powerful. Wrapping ourselves up in that is in our the entrancement that we have with technology, and how it's such an important part of Deckard and really the world of Blade Runner, but how the machines themselves are longing to disconnect from the slavery. And Westworld actually goes into the same ideas, right? Is if you have something that is close to sentient as possible, as close to humanity as possible, and then you force it to do things that humans wouldn't want to do, is there some ethics involved there? And I think that's obviously something to look at. Both you and I, we saw the new Blade Runner 2049 with Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford and others. I thought it was another great sci-fi movie, visually compelling. You see a lot of really great futures in there. One thing that I actually thought was really interesting about Blade Runner 2049 was there was a lot of augmented reality, whether it is in the advertisement form, so the ability to sell people with augmented reality, but there was a person that was in the K character who's played by Ryan Gosling, and that person is artificial, and it's in some ways it's an extension of what Scarlett Johansson and Spike Jonze and Joaquin Phoenix did in Her. It's that Spike Jonze movie that came out about 5-6 years ago, where Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with the operating system. That I think that was particularly compelling. You also see the eco genocide as well, the ecological issues, and Los Angeles now. In 2019, it was this wet, kind of murky, gross place, and fast forward 30 years later, and it's ecological disaster because the human beings have wrecked the planet, have left it a desert hellscape. So again, wonderful movie, great way of exploring the same sort of concepts. I thought Blade Runner may have captured it in a weird, better, much better than the new 2049. I think 2049 visually was particularly compelling, but in some ways the original Blade Runner I thought was more of it was one of our first sci-fi movies that was deeper than just having the beautiful aesthetics and this dark place and a noir effect. There's a lot going on, a lot of subtext when it came to Blade Runner, and it was just really, really fantastic.
Yeah, well, I think we can't be futurists without looking at some of the technologies that in both movies. And I'll start with the original. So I love the fact that they had like Polaroids, and they were considering Polaroids would be around, and they talked about. So they had like 7-digit phone calling. I think that was really funny. As we now have much larger. Some of the technologies they had were obviously just way too over the top. So it did have those visuals. Like they had like the hair dryer, which into the like about 54 minutes into the movie that looked like something from the 60s that you could stand under. They had like Pan Am that they were Pan Am that they were putting out there. I think that's cool. But then there's some really neat ideas if you look at it from a futurist perspective. Like they had the world so that where AI was so prevalent that even toys were intelligent. When it came out, JS, all of those toys that could see and look and that was pretty cool. I think that there's some, the idea of these superhuman robots that we were talking about that would withstand cold. And I can't. One thing that I thought was really neat, they gave them these 4-year lifespans. These 4 years is all you had to live, and so that's what brought out these ideas, I guess, of humanity for me, is that you have such a brief time to make your impact on the world, and being able to do that is I think that was a good reflection of what made it a great sci-fi movie for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a noir classic. I think it's a classic futures aesthetic. Do yourself a favor, go check it out on Netflix. If you get to see it on celluloid, that's even better. The 2049 is also great. I think it's a great duo if you could see them in the same week to kind of compare and contrast what's going on. But don't sleep on 1982's Blade Runner. Not a lot of people have seen it. It's a little long in the tooth, maybe a little bit, but it's okay because it's really well put together. And when you think that this came out in 1982, it'll fascinate you that much more that they really had their finger on the pulse of what the future of sci-fi could be. So yeah, go check out Deckard and Blade Runner. I think you'll really enjoy it.
All right, folks, it's time for FizBiz.
FizBiz, let's do it.
Yeah, it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty of business and technology and learn us some stuff. So, quick disclaimer, folks. Like always, we're not responsible for your losses, as these are our opinions. So please don't sue us. We don't have any money anyway. So, so for our FizBiz today, it might be a bit of a no-brainer, but for some of our listeners, but it may not be as big of a no-brainer as you may have kind of sort of thought it is, because we're going to give you some facts to back this up. So during this FizBiz, we decided to concentrate on investing in India. Now, up until recently, people used to think of India as a second or even a third world country with an extremely large population made up mostly of rural and urban poor and full of corruption with little to no way to safely invest. And it was that country until the 20th century, was basically frowning upon it. Now, while the nation did gain independence in 1947, it was a hard-fought independence, and many wars were fought afterwards due to religious and political differences. Okay, I'm sorry. However, these ideas have been changing as there is a lot to like in India right now. In its 70 years since independence, India has transformed its economy from one mostly reliant on farming to one that is booming, and one that has skipped the industrial steps that most countries, such as China and the Asian tigers, took to become first and second world nations. They did this to develop a service-based economy that is only continuing to grow. Earlier this year, the Boston Consulting Group put out a statement stating that India will be the third largest consumer market in the world by 2025. Part of this reason is that incomes are rising in India. In 2005, 44% of the country was considered struggling, with only 42% just getting by. Today, the extreme poor account for 31%, and it's shrinking, and 45% are considered the solidly working class. That upwardly mobile people continue to rise from 8% in 2005 to 15% currently, and the upwardly mobile will constitute 25% of the population by 2025. Affluent Indians now number 17 million households, with an expected 33 million by 2025. Just to put that in perspective, currently 43 million households in the United States are considered affluent, according to an ABC News report conducted in July of this year. Another factor to India's continued growth is the fact that women are entering higher education at unprecedented levels in India, with more women now attending high school than men, and women entering college or university level education is at 20% to men who are at 22% of the population. Now, this isn't to say that India is a perfect place to invest. In fact, it was only since the 1990s that India began to really tackle its rampant corruption and address many of the issues plaguing the country. However, the crux of my argument was way back in 2009, and and it remains so today, is that India is a country that, unlike so many other developing nations, has a democratic process that has existed since the writing of its constitution in 1950 and has lasted through today. India is the world's largest democracy. There's no other way around it. It also has a young population who are entering education at unprecedented levels, who are willing to buy and make Indian, and who are influencing the world's culture and how the world does business. Forbes magazine wrote in September of this year that India, and not China, is crucial to the future of BRICS, which is the body of developing nations, and represents Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The fact that India is a democracy with a mostly free market, unlike China, whose government is business friendly and passing major reforms, cannot be understated. Democratic countries, while not perfect, they do promote growth. They allow investors to enter a country and feel protected, and allows for greater liberties for its citizens to focus on economic endeavors without the fear of being thrown in jail for no reason, as China can do. Further, India is a country where investors can feel that their money and intellectual property is safe. Further, this has been proven to not exist in China, which is known for taking technologies of companies, adapting those technologies for their own purposes despite existing patents, and then using that information to compete with the companies who enter their markets. This protectionism has spawned a large amount of companies unwilling to locate businesses in China or unwilling to relocate any significant resources in that country for fear of protectionist measures by China or unfair competition. So then, with a developing country like India, how do you invest? If you're listening to this show, you probably are a technology adherent, but you may be unaware of several Indian technology companies that are as big as Apple in India. While the point of this segment is to not go into each of them, it is important to know the names of Tata, Wipro, Infosys, among others, who are large Indian companies with international presence, including here in the United States, who are doing business. You may even be more surprised, although good for you if you aren't, that Tata Motors division actually owns companies like Jaguar and Land Rover. So if you're looking at purely the stock market, you should be aware of two funds. There's the Matthews India Investor, MINDX, and the iShares MSCI India ETF, INDA. The Matthews Fund has annual expenses of around $112 per $10,000, while those for the iShares ETF are around $68 per $10,000 invested. So if you're a business owner, you should look at the major technology companies in India, but you should also look at the retail market. Spending in India is going to grow exponentially because of a young population who is increasing their wealth and spending their money on luxury goods. Furthermore, more and more Indians are putting their money into the stock market, which according to Forbes is highly undervalued. Moreover, India's internet penetration, while lagging behind other countries, is improving, and several Indian cell phone makers are doing quite well and are expanding into international operations. If I see one trend emerging out of all of this, is that internet shopping is exploding in India right now. And I can see why companies like Amazon are fully attempting to take advantage of this growing global trend. So, Chris, tell me, what do you think? Why is it a good idea to invest in India? What trends do you see happening? Give us what you think.
Well, one's just the size, right? The one thing about that everyone talked when it came to China was that there was just so many people that once China awoke, it would be this large economic powerhouse because there's people you can put to work. They could be in factories. They can, it can create a robust middle class. And China now is a global superpower in 30 or 40 years. And what I would say is, probably definitely a balancing power in the United States, where the United States has really dominated as the only global superpower. So I would probably put Germany and probably United States and China, but more specifically United States and China as a true superpower. So India has more people than China, and I think you're starting to see some of the foundations of what India could be. Now, of course, India has a great education system. They have the largest education system in the world, and they crank out tons of engineering, chemistry, physicists, computing technology folks. The second largest population currently, right? But a very young population, which means that that's a lot of people that can do a lot of really great, skills and services, and an economy that is and will be growing because of everything that you've mentioned. The fact that, they have so many people, that can, buy and purchase things now, and that are coming out of the poverty that they once were in for so long. And now you're starting to see the very beginning. We're not, it's not solidified, or not solidified, at least in China, but, you're starting to see what a middle class in China looks like when you have a robust, middle class in India. I think they will definitely be a company not a company, but a country that can be a part of the global power index, right? Just because of sheer size alone. So, I think you've got a lot of really interesting factors that could make an India a particularly positive and viable place coming in the in the coming decades. I think I'm not saying it's too early to invest because this is the time, right? As they're emerging, you're going to be able to definitely benefit on their high growth rates. I think they're growing at 9%, which is really, super fantastic. And they have a lot of these great factors, like I was saying, the science and technology that's coming out. They've got mass transit systems. Tourism is becoming, that much more important there because they've similar to China. They've opened up their borders to travel, and I think people are starting to see the excitement that is the Indian culture, how beautiful it is, and it's huge, and it all from the Himalayas all the way to a beautiful beach party that you can have in Goa. India is a very unique and interesting place with really great people too, very nice, and respectful and fun people. I do think, though, that there's some caution here. I think it needs to be stewarded properly. They need to ensure that they make the right investments in education as well as infrastructure, so they can make positive change to sort of crank out that growth as much as they can. I also think that they would do themselves a service by creating a society that is that can grow the middle class as quickly as it can, and you do that through education and through transit systems and other things that could grow. But also pay very close attention to how you're going to deal with your environment. It's a really big issue currently right now. I don't know if you've been seeing, but Delhi and Mumbai have a lot of pollution that's causing a lot of issues in the metropolises there. And this will obviously continue to happen as there's more people with more vehicles, and the infrastructure and is not in place to properly regulate how fossil fuels are used to power their economy. Keep in mind too, they're still stuck in the hydrocarbon fossil fuel production that the United States has curtailed at least a little bit, because we're just that much more progressed down this sort of economic evolution. So India is a fantastic, interesting story. I think if you're going to be a part of its investment, I think you would behoove yourself to pay very close attention not only to the power of the Indian buyer, but also the power of the Indian state, because the Indian state is going to have to ensure that they steward their economy as adroitly as they can.
So I guess, in the end, folks, what I'll say is, if it's up to you to think that it's just, think if we're right. Is India a really good long-term investment? Is it better than a long-term investment in China? If you think so, and we didn't cover it in this segment, tell us what we left out. Or if you disagree with us, tell us so as well. We want to hear from you. Thank you. Okay, great. So for the interview segment of the podcast, we have Derek Woodgate with us. So Derek Woodgate is a consulting futurist, educator, author, speaker, and curator. He's a founder and chief futurist as well. And his expertise is the future of learning, the future of multimedia and entertainment, especially the fusing of these two fields. He and his colleagues have spent really the past 20 years working on foresight projects in all sorts of major industries and dozens of world-renowned clients. He's assistant professor at the University of Agder in Norway,
an adjunct professor at GSU, teaching the future of education and learning technology division. He's the director of future learning at the Future Labs nonprofit Life, which is learning innovations for future education. Founding member and ex-board member of the Association of Futurists, a professional member of the World Future Society, the ex-president of the Central Texas chapter of the WFS. Geez, there's just so much stuff that you've got going on, Derek. How do you have the time?
Well, I'm a typical Mac job type of guy, right? I have 3 Mac jobs. What can I tell you? Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me on. Yeah, how do you do it? You just, well, a lot of it is cross-mapping, right? So you find things that work together and you build them. But the principle, I think, is always have a vanity project.
Sure, absolutely.
So things that you don't make sufficient money out of to make them your real job, but they're really your love in life. Do it, and sometimes it becomes your job. So I've had a number of those. And interestingly, when one looks back on one's life and sees, where you start, what you studied, and what you get degrees in, where you sort of go down a road, you begin to look at the end and say, hey, it's pretty damn good. But what was interesting, never ever thought I'd end up here. What is a futurist? Who knew what a futurist was, 30 years ago? Damn it. A few people at SRI and so on. So, it's been sort of a sort of a move. And I think that, interestingly, one of my colleagues, Jim Data, whom I'm sure you've read,
he's and just for the audience, Jim Dater is a really important futurist, steeped in normative futures at the University of Hawaii. Yeah, so matter of fact, we need to get him on the show.
He's a great guy, and but one of the things that's very interesting, he has this sort of 12 or whatever number of sort of elements that make up a futurist. The perfect futurist speaks 27 languages. He's conversant in 20 cultures. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it goes on and on. And it sort of was quite a guiding thing for me in the sense to see, looking at that and then sort of mapping out how do you live, right? And so a lot of times when I'm introducing myself, not necessarily in a podcast, but to students, the first time they meet me, I talk a lot about, hey, what I learned from Fluxus, what did I learn from, Sinan Noir? What did I learn from, going to a Pink Floyd concert in 1967? What all this stuff, right? Because the thing about this is, it's all these things make up your life, and you don't really think about them maybe until later, just how much they contribute to your attitudinal approach to work and life, right, and what you bring to the table. And I think that this is not a plug, but in Future Frequencies, where I started to look at how you use, for example, progressive culture as a thinking approach to future studies. It was quite unique at the time, and all the things. It's paradigm shifting. No, but to be fair, progressives in terms of art, artist type progressives, are one group of people who don't have to think too much about whether they're making money out of it, and therefore they are able to sort of use extreme imagination to come up with ideas. And I think that, looking back over all the things you've just said, which are true, all those different areas in some way do get fused, but in other ways are distinctive enough to bring different things to the table. And what I mean by different things, not knowledge. Knowledge is a different quantity, but thinking techniques. And if I would say anything that's critical to future studies, anything to my view on future studies, it's what sort of alternative thinking techniques can I apply to different parts of the process, which are going to optimize the outputs from that part of the process. And I think that's really critical. So a lot of future studies is very linear. We have to use systems dynamic modeling and mapping and a whole host of deep analysis and CLA, and causal layered analysis and things like that, which are very, in many ways, very sort of, I would say, linear in their approach, but a very big part of it. The part where you've really got to sort of make the difference is very much about creative thinking and very much about, how do you get to rhizomatic thinking? How do you get to these sort of like ideas of, that really break the mold? If you're working with just continuous change, you can't literally use evolutionary thinking to get there, right? I mean, it's not how it works. That's the difference between a strategic planner and a futurist. And I think that what happens is that we, or at least I, tend to look for these new modes of thinking, whether it's taking something from Deleuze, or I don't know, punk. It doesn't really matter to me where it comes from. It's what resonates with me and the way I can think about things differently. And so, yeah, I think all this, what you do and what you bring to the table, and yes, try to integrate it, but actually a lot of the time I'm disintegrating it to try and get, many, you will know certainly, and people know this term I coined, think like a DJ, right? And I'll digress slightly of how I come to that, because I've always sort of worked on those lines, and in Future Frequencies I talked about how you literally do that. And then I sat down, I was on a panel at South by Southwest with DJ Spooky, who I've worked with a number of times, the philosopher DJ. And I said, hey, let's chat afterwards and talk to me. How do you really do this stuff? How do you really, what's the theory behind deconstructing, finding totally disconnected ideas and then reconstructing them? How do you, and we got into this whole sort of conversation about that. And I realized that, future studies in a sense has a lot of those elements to it. That whole sort of, when you get to the sort of scenario type, I agree in the beginning as you're going through the process and all the scanning and everything else, that's one thing. When you're getting to your future drivers and your insights, but when you're really trying to build back off that, so once you've got your platforms, moving to those scenarios, and particularly in my case, because I have to do sort of implementable and the implementation part of the scenarios, then you've just got to lose it. You just got to get out there, and it doesn't matter whether your ideas are sort of influenced by comedy, whether they're influenced by humor, whether they're influenced, by, I don't know, science fiction or rugby. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's finding the right elements at any given point that really influence you. And my sort of this sort of elements of what, imagination and the whole area around imagination development is probably one of the most critical things that I work with, and particularly in that area that you were talking about, that I deal with, which is, personal engagement and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's, having a dislocated career at every given point is not a bad thing.
No, it's a great thing, and I think that's a really interesting frame, right? Mixing futures, having the ability, and I, Jack and I talk about this on the show all the time. Futurists have to have an open mind, have to be able to seek information wherever it goes, and that's where I want to kind of lead this talk with you here, because I know you have a background of music. You've been you've worked in the entertainment field, and I thought we could ask questions about some of your work there. And one question I think is really important to start out is, why is experience so important to future studies, right? And I'm not just talking about what we were just alluding to, which is experiencing life and then putting that into how we frame a future, but also stepping inside. I know you yourself have created experiential futures. We've had Trevor Haldenby come and talk to us about experiential futures. Why is experience important to future studies?
I think that if you, depending what sort of futurist you are and what you're dealing, right? So there are elements here, and one can't talk for a whole swath of futurists, because clearly there's a big difference between practicing business futurists and people who work on political agendas 50 years out or whatever. But in general, I think one of the things is this, that and when I talk about experiential, I have different elements to experiential, and I'll come back to it. But you've got to look at what experience is, right? So experience is made up of a whole host of things that come from, building memory, building, this sort of multi-sensory engagement that you have. And, I could argue that what I was talking about earlier, the remix lifestyle, is a pretty critical element to sort of having this multi-sensory engagement, right? But multi-sensory engagement and the whole the whole thing around experience, let's call it that for a second, is tied into how we, and particularly futurists, when we're talking about how the future sort of functions through steep and stuff, is having this multi-layers of experience, right? So when I talk about new spatial narratives, and when I talk about narratives in that context, are not just a story, but new spatial narratives, living and behaving in very different environments and having to deal with different environments can give you an indication, particularly if you're sort of really observant of where those environments are going and how they've changed over a period of time. So, if you, I'll use music because, if one was look at what it was like to go in 1967 to a Pink Floyd concert, or to go to a Pink Floyd concert in, this year, because there was one, this sort of, you can gain a lot of what I'd call not just, so there are two aspects. There's the experiential aspect. So what did I get from it? What was the sort of, what took me in? What was the conduit between me and what was happening on stage? What were the elements, of why was it actually relevant to be there both in the flesh, right, when one could have a virtual experience? And we know that virtual experiences actually in many ways are just the same as the real thing, right? I mean, it's a bit like having a dream about your wife being unfaithful to you, and you wait up and for 2 days you can't deal with it, even though that she was lying in bed next to you, right? I mean, it's these things that happen in the imagination are very, very strong. So you could have that virtual experience. It could be, just as strong, if not greater in many ways. But being there in the flesh, right, brings certain things. And that's because of the way that this creating what I call personal ambience actually works, right? So personal ambience comes from you interfacing through a conduit to whatever the presentation is, right? Well, it could be TV, or in this particular case, a band on stage, all the artifacts around that, so the enhancements around that, and how that feeds back to you neurologically, right? And it comes back into what did you let in? So so we all go to a show, you see it one way, I see it the other way, we could come back out and you go, oh, that was crap, or that was like that, or did you see that, or did you notice that thing happening or not? Future studies is a bit like that, right? Because we want to sort of see what we want to, what we feel is likely to happen. So if you talk to me about any technology or social environment or these new narratives that I'm talking about, it's about what I feel. It's what I let in. It's that personal ambience that I create. And I personally believe that there are these very strong areas in which you can deal with that. And why are they important? So the importance of going through a whole lifetime, I'm going to take music since obviously, I'm just as likely to go to a Three-Door Cinema Club concert as I am. And I'm actually not likely to go to a Pink Floyd concert because I only follow what's happening now. So if I went to, I don't know, some, concert that was really sort of really relevant today, it would be more what I do. But and that's why I've always kept ahead of all this stuff, right? I mean, I'm not very, and I think that Jim says this, we're not very nostalgic. We live our lives in the present. And part of the meaning of that is, and to be fair, is that we do keep going forward. So we talk about sort of these emerging issues going forward in future studies, but we are the emerging issues, right? We're part of those emerging issues. And it's very, very typical of people in future studies. So when you talk about a show like that, what I'm looking at the show, doesn't matter what artist it is. If I'm going to see, Trent Reznor, I might not go to see Trent Reznor anymore because of 9 Inch Nails or the thing he does with his wife. I'm going to see what the projection mapping's like. I'm going to see how this show's put together. I'm going to show what it's really doing for me. What is, what's happening what are the sensory sort of experiences I'm getting from that show, and how do they differ from what I've seen in the past? Now, I don't want to take away from the actual experience of the show, but the dynamics of that are very, very different. And when you start to talk about how we as humans change over a period of time, right? When we get to this remix lifestyle thing, the whole, multiple identities and new archetypes we take, how we recontextualize, things. So A show isn't a show isn't a show. 1967 to 2017, we know that the concept of a show generally, both in reality and in our minds, would be very, very different. It's like the issue of social, or the issue of a friend, or anything else, right? I mean, ask someone, a gamer, who a friend is, he's not going to give you the same answer as someone who was talking about friends prior to online gaming. And so when I'm going along, that's why I think that experience is important in keeping up with what's happening. It's about that, that sort of real virtuality, right? That thing that you're sort of feeling inside. So what you led into personal ambience. And how do you play that back? How do you take that sensory personal ambience and put it actually into your work? And I think that's what makes a good futurist, because that thing that I call the extended self, right, allows us to shift gears when we're thinking about the future. You can't think about the future and make it an extension of today. What you've got to be looking at is going, wow, that is crazy different. I just saw Jack Garrett, and he's sort of using instrumentation I've never seen in my life before. What did that add to that? What was the sort of the shifts I got with that? And where did that take me? Or alternatively, I may have just seen a folky sort of, Ed Sheeran or someone, and say, well, how's Ed Sheeran as a personal performer, changing the way quasi-folk music is being delivered in 2017? Hey, there are 100,000 people at this concert. Shit, this is not, this is pretty cool for a guy who's standing there playing guitar. Why, And so I'm always looking at those dimensions of what that's doing at the same time as I'm monitoring how are we changing? What are the new archetypes? What are the new concepts? What do multiple identities bring to that? What's this nomadic living that we have, these reconfigurable lives that we're beginning to build? How do they influence that? How do they work with that? Then I can start to look at real disruptors. And the first time I ever went to see, and probably, projection mapping as staging, rather than seeing the real thing. So if you go back to, I think it was 2014, the Beyonce one, where she actually fell through the stage, if I remember correctly. And if you actually looked at the complexity of doing that, right? So how do you actually get an artist to fall through a stage? Not going down a trapdoor, but the whole stage, everything just disintegrated before your eyes, right? You're going, holy shit, that's giving a completely different dimension to what I understand a show to be. So a lot of my experience in this is, how do I bring that then to think about any concept that I'm playing with? Because it's easy to map back. It's easy to say, a friend's different, learning's different. Social means something completely different today than it did 15 years ago. Banking means something completely different today with online banking than it did when we had to wait in a queue for 2 hours at lunchtime. But by the same token, I'm having to work out. I'm working in unknown landscapes. So to get a vision, I've got to experience things that are happening in a very, very different way. It's not enough to put on some VR glasses and say, oh, that was cool. It's what's it doing inside? What's the personal ambience I'm creating, and how's that feedback being created? How am I going to take that to the next level? What am I missing from that? What were the sensory cues I didn't get that I'd really like to get?
Okay. Yeah. No, it's totally awesome, and thank you for letting us get that insight, because I think that's really important for futurists to understand that they need to take a look at the world through a different lens, and I think that's really important. So let's go back to that difference, right? You were saying a concert or an experience, whether it's VR, whether it's AR, whether it's new future music, is a lot different in 2017 than it was in 1967. So maybe, this could be a short question that's going to have a long answer, but what is the future of experience?
Well, the future of experience, is driven by a whole, a lot of different aspects, right? So first of all, you've got to sort of look at I have this sort of phrase, and you may have seen it, this whole thing about body data space, right? So when I'm breaking down an experience, I have a whole thing on how to break down an experience, but specifically, I'm looking at what's happening in the body, and I include the mind with the body, by the way. Maybe I'm not spiritual enough to separate them all out, but I actually see the human. So when I mean the body, I mean the whole human, the holistic human. The data, so the data that we're receiving, whatever format that data can be, and the space and the environment in which that happens. These are critical elements to me. And they're sort of like a framework, right? The way I look at it, the framework of how I'm building up a story, I suppose you'd say, about what an experience can be. That's the first thing I'd say about it. So if I'm looking at an interactive installation that uses what the technology is, what is critical to me is on these three planes, what is actually happening? What's happening to me? What's happening with the data? What sort of data is it? And what's happening within that space? And I talked about spatial narratives. And so when I see space, I don't mean just a square box. I mean, what's the narrative that space is given? And what's the potential narrative that space could give, right? So it doesn't have to be a white wall or four walls. It can be anything. It can be completely unframed, right? And that's one of the big issues today about in the art world, that nearly everything's always being framed, right? In some form, you go to a framer and you put in a frame. In actual fact, thankfully, because of installations, we got rid of a lot of that framing, but that's changing the narrative. So to me, when I look at what the experience is going forward, I think that, and it depends on where that experience is happening, right? So if it's an augmented experience, I mean, I don't believe all, experiences going forward are going to be, technically generated, or they're going to be driven from some implant that allows us to have, an extension of ourselves that gives us a different type of sense. I mean, there will be that, but at the same time, there'll just be that ordinary, went to see my grandmother, right, type of entertainment, which is a very different type of, primary sort of experience. So there's all these together. I think one of the problems we always see when we're working with the future, it's very easy to say, this is happening, and it's going to completely replace that. No, that's not how it works. It goes in parallel. At some points it may take over, but basically it works and it merges, right? And it's sort of, and that's why at the end, if you look at it years later, you're looking and say, well, in many ways that was evolution. It seemed like it was revolutionary at the time, but it was built off. The computer was built off of the keyboard, the typewriter, or we have all these things, right? We say, well, nothing's revolutionary. Well, some things are, but in the main, you see them more as evolutionary. And I think their experiences, and this is why this is important, I think we want, and that we'll be able to have, and that's a big difference, very many types of experiences, far more customized and programmed experiences, whether they're programmed externally or programmed internally. And I don't mean internally through a chip, but in the way that we are evolving.
Well, and Derek, I have sort of a question on that. Is I think it kind of piggybacks off what you're saying as far as so I'm a gamer, and I look at the future of gaming as and I look at what the role of artificial intelligence, VR, AR, all have in that. And I know you write about that. Can you tell us more about what you see is the future of that entertainment experience?
Well, I think the thing at the moment when we look at those, and they're all happening. Well, I mean, certainly we're using them in learning, so they do exist and what's happening. AI is a slightly different. Let's put it to one side slightly, and AI has so many applications that it's a little different. But AR and VR, because they're the two things we throw together, right? So VR can be a very simple thing, so that I create a VR world and I go into it and I move around and I do certain things. So Silent Hill in VR, right? I'm in, I play, I move, I'm feeling it, I'm part of it. Now, two things can happen. One, I can stay external to it, 180-degree vision. Well, I mean, 70 degrees is our foveal view, so, you don't really get much more than that, but, more immersed, right? So immersion is a critical thing here. So that combination of interaction and immersion. And basically, one of the ideal situations here is that if it's purely internal, that I go in and I completely forget that I'm me. Okay? So anyone that's played FIFA, this is a good example of this, right, knows that you curse every time you play with a team as a person you know, right? So let's say I'm playing Real Madrid and Ronaldo screws up. I shout at Ronaldo, right? The next time I'm Man U and I'm playing Real Madrid, and Ronaldo's totally amazing and I can't deal with him, finally I realize this is me. That isn't Ronaldo at all, even though my mind has projected me completely onto being that person. I'm really pissed at Ronaldo. I'm not pissed at me. I'm really pissed at me, right? That the haptic I'm using is not the best, or whatever excuse I want to make. But I don't do that. I get so immersed in the environment and so immersed in that experience that I become that experience. That's the optimal, right? And that's just just think about that today as an internalized thing, because we've been playing FIFA since 1997 or whatever it is, and it's got better and better and better. And the better it's become, it's not just a blob of blonde stuff on a stick, to actually someone mapping every single movement until you think, you actually see this person, you can feel him, So we've seen these changes, and of course that drives you in more. So the more that reality comes to play, it begs a question. Does the hyper-reality take us away from what we're feeling, or does it immerse us more? So it immerses us more when the sensory stimulation that we get in addition to that. So that moment when we start to get more and more augmentation, right? So, and I'm not talking about overlays here like AR overlays, because actually AR overlays are going to ruin that feeling, right, in many ways, because AR overlays in general, unless they're just pure AR overlays that don't have any words or whatever it is, but if they start to have information, data, that's going to be awful. I don't really want to know what Ronaldo's, scores have been over the last 20 years when I'm him. I should know what they are because it's me, right? So we don't want that. That's not a way of doing it. What we want are these sensory things. I feel it through my veins, right? That I feel it in my heart. Now I'm feeling this immersion within him. And this can come from different things. It can come purely from sensory attachments. It could come from, obviously, ultimately, brain interfaces, which it will. I'm pretty sure it will. But it can also come very much so from the way that things are shot and the way that I perceive and within that environment, right? So at the moment, most things are shot, other than 360-degree VR, most things are shot pretty well head on. And even those, you have to move around to get them. Now, what about if they were shot from all multiple angles, all different times, and that I was feeling it very, very differently? I don't know if you ever saw Time Code. It was a movie that had 4 screens to it. It was quite interesting, actually. It had 4 screens, and one screen was always what was actually you were supposed to be following, the narrative. And the other 3 screens were basically showing you what was actually going on at the same time. Because when you watch a movie, and what happened was the one that was actually supposed to be watching, all the time was in color, or not in color, but more clear. And the other 3 were knocked back. So you knew they were going on. And so you saw this other action, normal things that are happening, like in life, because normally when we watch a film, you're watching only the bit that they want you to see. But I actually believe that something like the effects in Time Code, where I'm getting multiple dimensions of a situation happening at the same time, will give it a degree of reality that we simply don't have at the moment, and that VR doesn't give us at the moment. So I think that once you start to sort of feel this sense of extended self, right, this feeling where the experience is greater than any experience I've been able to have in the real world, and I believe this will happen within the next 7 to 8 years, then that's where VR has a place that's incredibly different in entertainment, to the one it has at the moment. Now, AR is a different thing, right? Because AR has to be over reality at the moment. It won't always. There'll be AR over VR. And AR has this it's adding us a dimension that's usually formative or knowledge-based dimension. It doesn't have to be. Now, it could be a transfer of information into sensory moments, right? So I don't know if you've ever seen things like the emotion mirror that MIT developed. So, you look into that mirror and it pulls up words, and there's quite a lot of artwork's been done like this. The French have done a lot of things where music with a load of words. And it's interesting how those words give you this cognitive relationship with what you're listening to. If they weren't there, you'd be just listening to the audio and creating your own cognitive relationship with the music. But because it suddenly says firestorm, right? And then it changes to something else. Cognitively, the narrative that's being driven gives you a different experience of what you would be getting if it was without that. What I'm going to see I think we'll see augmented reality play a different type of role than what we see it purely from an information ad. I think it'll be a sensory ad. The more that we understand feedback and understand what those words actually can generate in us and how to play them. So what you're seeing in parallel here is, these new multimedia or mixed media technologies coming together at a time when we're getting incredibly deep on two other things, right? So neuroscience, so far better understanding what all this means and how do we integrate that into what we're developing, whether it's content or tools or anything else. And at the same time, we're getting this situation whereby we are able to, have AI agents that help us, feel something different, or, we're having, interactive sculptures that are in the background that are doing things. There's lots of other ways of doing this. And one thing about the show, and I don't know, we develop shows, as you know, and we try to develop those shows in a way that they're experiential. So we talk about experiential entertainment. And we have a very different approach to how we feel about that, right? Because at the end of the day, all our shows are about living the future, right? So what we do is we bring to the table, we do all this work on future studies for clients, and we do all this really brilliant work, which I can't use because, it's confidential, and it's going to come out in 10 years and all this and the other. But some of the ideas, the thinking that goes behind it, I can bring to the public. And what I want to do is to bring these experience, the content, first of all, so that we see this positive future. It could be a negative, but I like to bring as much positive as future, and let them live it. So test some of these things we're talking about, have them made up in rough. It doesn't matter, they've not had them before. Show them how that experience could be. Because what I'm looking at ultimately, and most of the work I'm looking at, is engagement and personal ambience. And what does this do to us? What does it do to us as humans? How does it improve us as humans? How much more empathy can we get out of that? How much more fun? I don't mind hedonism. I'm one of the most hedonistic people in my life that, I know. But let's have a bit of the other as well. Let's have this sort of harmonized approach to this. So I suppose that's how I see those. Now, AI is a little different. I talked about agents, and a lot of the work that I work with a guy called Brian Majerko at Georgia Tech. Very close friend of mine, really good guy, brilliant guy actually. And so he runs a lab called the Adam Lab, and he's actually using AI with the arts, right? So he plays them together, and they build things like how to teach kids to program, and he uses music for that, right? Music composition, and they go through this whole course, and at the end of it, they're excited because they can do a hip hop piece that came out of programming. So these guys are great at code, they're great at structure, they're great at understanding music structure, and they build composition. They didn't even know they were doing it. And I like the things he's doing. He has things like the drawing apprentice. It's a simulator. It's an AI simulator that works with you. It's called upskilling, right? That helps you to do things that you just couldn't do. And you keep, repeating the mood. And after a while, you can actually draw things pretty well. So I like this sort of the use of AI, because of the experience it gives you, because all these experiences really enhance you as an individual, right, in terms of self-esteem and extending your abilities. But at the same time, what I like about it, it really is teaching people skills, so 21st century skills, that are usable both in whether they're going to college afterwards or work or whatever. So there are these double or treble values that he's bringing to bear in the work that he's doing. So I love that, and I work with him on a lot of things around that. And in all honesty, I think when we talk about experience and experiential entertainment, a lot of these things, I mean, I could raffle off, 100 things that are happening today that give us 2 dimensions, whether it's robot cameras or, as I mentioned earlier, something like data sculptures for socialization and data collection. There's 1,000 things, like programmable surfaces, I don't know, things in digital improv that give us cognitive functions and all this stuff, right? It's all out there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's very nice to be able to co-create an experience with an AI agent. But ultimately, my interest is, what does that AI agent bring to the table in its human-to-human collaboration that is going to enhance what I'm getting, whether that's enhancing it in a primary sense or enhancing it in an extended human sense. That doesn't matter. But that's where I come from on this, I suppose. And I say, we happily talk to you about, 100 things about, what's actually happening in text, like, adaptive digital media and all this stuff. But realistically, unless that has a place to play, and it will happen, right? So independent reasoning technologies, once we begin to see AI shifting in a different way, we'll begin to see in gaming and certain other areas, some of the learning things we're looking at, and randomization and, morphscapes and all this thing that's sort of happening. Yeah, that's going to change things. The ability to mimic emotions, right? So the stuff I'm working with, if it's mimicking emotions, gives me emotional feedback that I wouldn't normally get. They're all bits of adding to that experience, how do we fill in data? By using new algorithms that show the bits that are missing. In gaming, there's lots of lapses, right? There are bits that are missing from the story because just the cost of putting them all in would be incredibly expensive. But once an agent can fill in that data, how they fill it in, and it's emotional feedback type of data, that's going to be different. All the things we're doing with biometric neural learning, right? It's changing those dimensions. So yes, I honestly believe that AI and all the things going on will add a incredibly different dimension. But my interest is what is that doing for us? And our experience of what we're going through. That's a personal thing, of course,
Sure.
Other people will be looking at a different aspect. Anyway,
sure.
Sorry. It's a long-winded answer to a complex question.
Well, so and I noticed you've used this phrase before, from experience to ambience. How are the future technologies that you were just speaking on going to change, the way humans experience entertainment, music, just learning about things they haven't learned, whether it's like we were talking about, strapping on VR goggles or just stepping into a wondrous auditory experience. How is experience going to turn in something that is more ambience and changes our ways of viewing ourselves in that sort of entertainment concept?
Well, the ways of doing it are obviously multiple. And as I mentioned before, there's not one. Well, let's put it like this. There's times when a sound or an explanation what someone is doing in music. So if I took, and I mentioned earlier, if I took someone like Jack Garrett, since he uses electronica and guitar-based stuff and a whole lot of stuff happening, right? So I'd like to know, it's personal, what's actually happening. right? So that gives me a different type of experience. So that's an experience. It's not, it can be an ambient experience, because the moment that I now know, this obviously depends how much you know about music, but that there's an overlay of X, Y, and Z on this. And that's why I'm feeling fuzzy, because actually it's not a cello, and I can't work this damn thing out. It's not a cello that normally makes me really feel fuzzy. It's something completely different, but it's been mimicked in some way to do that. But it tells me, right? The text will tell me what's happening now is X, Y, and Z. That's one type of experience, a more pure, I mean, more simple and pure type of experience. And yes, it adds ambience, of course, it adds to my enjoyment and my personal ambience. But that's not the same as something that mimics my emotions and feeds them back to me, right? Or that can take counter emotions, or mirror, it can either mirror or take countering emotions and feed those back to me, so that it's combative in some form, right? So that I'm actually, doing something and feeling something, but at the same time, something else is pushing the other way. In gaming, that would make it more difficult. For example, how does it make it more difficult, even though if you're in control of it? And that brings me the emotional as well as the physical, right, in gaming. That could be in anything, but, specifically watching a show. Depends where you watch it, whether you're watching it virtually or in the place. But, if you actually were able to see a real show in virtuality, whether or not that was a combination of real people on stage with, holograms on stage playing with, a robot on stage playing whatever, it doesn't really matter, right, what that is. But if you were to have sensory, so through your sensors, personal sensors, wearables, whatever they happen to be, implants, if you were able to get emotional feedback from each of those elements that was intertwined, I think that would give you types of experiences that you've never had. And I said, personal ambience basically is what you let in. Okay, it's something you create within yourself ultimately. So I can, let in some things and not let in others, right? And if you're watching a movie, as a typical example, particularly on a 2D type screen, because, depending what you focus on as an individual, you can go and watch the movie and you'll say, oh my God, or TV program, did you see all that stuff going on? Did you see the technology they use on that? And the other person go, I have no idea what you're talking about. I watched the protagonist from beginning to end. I'm not even sure I understood the narrative very well, right? We all have these elements of these perspectives is what we're looking at. And I think the more that gets brought together by expanding the potential to experience all that within a broader elements, and I do actually think that VR will give us that opportunity once we have real, VR worlds and real sort of VR environments that are different. I mean, if you think about all the stuff that's been done with VR in terms of like flying, right? Hang gliding and stuff like that, right? At the moment, it's okay, and yes, you're doing things you could never see, but it's much more of a visual thing. You're not truly falling down a cliff. You're not, generally speaking, about to smash your head into something that's going to, And I think that once we start to see these additional elements, depending what we want to do and what we want to look in, these customized things, these things that understand us, these things that read who we are. Where do we have fear? When's that fear generated? How do we augment that fear in that moment? Because we wouldn't have the same experience. We can both go and watch a horror film and you can laugh your head off and I can half die. And that's because we're different. But if you have that person, that customized enhancement, and once neuro becomes much more intertwined with with the content we're putting out and the environment we're putting out, the ambience we're creating, I think that will change how each of us experiences. and we can choose. We'll be able to choose what sort of experience. We're going to be able to sort of ramp it up or turn it down. Do you want to see the knife really going in and turning and cutting the thing, or do I just want to see a knife going in and we go on to the next? And I think that we'll have those options.
Sure. Well, this has been fantastic. I really do appreciate you giving us this insights on the future of experience and what we can how we hope to step inside of them. Is there anything actually that you'd like to plug? Any new projects that you have coming out?
Well, we always have new projects. Most of them are confidential. But one thing we're working on in a major way at the moment, in addition to our normal the Futures Lab stuff. So the Futures Lab, it's been there 21 years. We have work. We have classic clients, new clients, different types of clients, right? But the Future Experience Lab, which has really been an extension of work that I've been doing since 2006, when we started doing work. First of all, we did the work in Austin. We did the first ever make show that was outside of California, Maker show. And then we went on to do work for South by Southwest, big shows, in fact, for 6 years or so, which we now help them work on their own versions of these. I do think the Future Experience Lab, where I'm really trying to look at how we generate these experiences and how we enhance, and their early steps, right? I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is 2025 to 2030. I have new people working with me, which is good. So a lot of sort of back-end technology people who, are better at actually making this stuff work. And, my life partner and, business partner, who's also a futurist, Helga Weigel, works with me every day on this stuff, and she's really got into AI, which is her particular sort of area of expertise at the moment. She did studied for a PhD in future studies in Hungary, and she's brought different dimensions to what we do on both those areas. But particularly, I think, with being able now to sort of create much more interactive technology, much more of an interactive experience, an immersive experience with these new relationships, I would suggest, look at what the Future Experience Lab is doing and what it can happen. What we've done, I'm very proud of what we've done over those, 11 years, but I know I'm going to be much more proud of the work we do over the next 11 years, because it's really, really an exciting time. So, yeah, well, I'd leave you with that, I think.
Well, I thank you so much. I think we're going to be checking out. Of course, we'll be putting that in the show notes so everybody can take a peek at that. David Woodgate, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining SomeFuture.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Loved it.